Germany had emerged from the Great War with its throat tightened by a document. The Treaty of Versailles not only cut its territory and dignity, it amputated its military muscle. The army was reduced to a symbolic number, without heavy artillery, without an air force, with an Allied commission watching to ensure that defeat did not turn into revenge. On paper, it was a disarmed country. In reality, it was a country that began to learn how to lie methodically. Reconstruction did not begin with parades or speeches. It began with offices. Not war ministries, but civilian departments that sounded like engineering, construction, and reconstruction. The key was not to build a new army in full view of the world, but to preserve knowledge, personnel, plans, and the capacity to produce again. A network was created that functioned like a second nervous system, discrete, compartmentalized, full of euphemisms. The military was written as technical. Artillery was hidden behind ambiguous names. Records were filled with grey words so that no one could point to a direct violation. Factories also learned to disguise themselves. Where cannons were once produced, suddenly civilian goods were manufactured. Not because the country had given up steel and gunpowder, but because it had understood that the Allied inspection looked at labels, not intentions. Production could be divided into loose pieces. One plant made components, another assembled, another stored far from obvious routes. This way, if an inspector appeared, each location could claim ignorance of the final destination. Responsibility was fragmented so that the trail was lost. Training followed the same logic. Uniforms disappeared, but learning continued. Technical academies, industrial courses, youth clubs, spaces that seemed innocent yet served to sustain a culture of military training. Retired officers taught mechanics, communications, navigation, applied chemistry. At first glance, they were technicians. In practice, they were a reserve of officers for the day the mask fell. And while all this was happening inside, Germany needed diplomatic oxygen outside. Here enters the second lane of the plan, the slow erosion of international control. Allied oversight was not dismantled with a slam of the door. It was weakened with patience, agreements, and measured gestures. The strategy was clear, not to break the treaty all at once, but to turn it into an increasingly flexible structure. At that stage, foreign policy was used as a tool of disarmament, but in reverse. Not to reduce capabilities, but to clear obstacles. The method consisted of projecting cooperation, avoiding open provocations, and at the same time pushing each negotiation toward a relaxation of controls. With the fear of Bolshevism growing on the European horizon, Germany began to be seen by some as a useful counterweight. That shift in perception opened doors. In that context, the controls began to loosen. The Control Commission reduced its presence, and the surveillance machinery was gradually deactivated. Locarno marked a symbolic point. Germany agreed to recognize its western borders and in return obtained a return to the international stage, an invitation to join the League of Nations. It was a double move. Externally, conciliation; internally, a platform. Because entering those forums was not just returning to the world, it was being able to discuss clauses, request revisions, and erode limits. Reintegration into the League of Nations was presented as a milestone of peace. Internally, it functioned as a stepping stone. From that position, pressure was applied to modify restrictions using legal language, arguments of fairness, with the exact tone to avoid alarm. The goal was not direct confrontation. The goal was attrition. And attrition worked because on the other side there was fatigue, economic crises, fear of another war, and a mix of disbelief and passivity. By the early 1930s, while the West looked on with inertia, clandestine rearmament was already more than a rumor. It was a structure. It was consolidated with parallel budgets, funding camouflaged in civilian accounts, and sports associations used as a cover for paramilitary training. The boundary between civilian and military became deliberately blurred, as if the entire country were a waiting room where no one spoke aloud what everyone was preparing. When that period reached its threshold, Germany was not yet a visible superpower. It was something more unsettling, a power in incubation with latent infrastructure, ready personnel, adaptable industry, and international control weakened by its own fatigue. The secret was not a single hidden factory. It was an entire system designed to survive the paper. And then, on January 30th, 1933, the country that had learned to hide welcomed a man who did not want to hide anything forever. Hitler comes to power and needs results. Hitler assumed power in a deteriorated country, unpayable debt, disarmed army, broken prestige. The Germany that would later be capable of sustaining a war against several powers at once, at that moment didn't even seem like a candidate to try. There was one piece of data that showed it harshly. Visible industrialization was below the image the world would associate with the country years later. Even car ownership was low compared to other countries. But the new regime needed something immediate: legitimacy. Shouts and flags were not enough. People had to feel that the state was working, that there was work, order, and a future. And in that first stage, the economy was not directed by a fanatic in uniform. It was directed by a technician with a reputation for fiscal discipline and respect for private property. Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank and a key figure in the initial machinery. Schacht was not, in his profile, the type of man one imagines designing an economy for total war. His role at first was more pragmatic: stabilize, promote public works, guarantee employment, sustain markets. He was the necessary showcase for a regime that was still consolidating its tentacles and needed to gain social support without immediately revealing the true destiny of the project. Investment was poured into infrastructure and labor, roads, public projects, economic movement that could be seen and touched. In this early stage, military spending existed, but it was not yet the heart of the budget. More than 2,000 million marks were spent on roads, while around 600 went to the military sector. That balance, however, was temporary, because the regime was not building prosperity as an ultimate goal, but command capacity. What Hitler needed was not a healthy economy in classical terms. He needed an obedient economy. And as the party consolidated power, one word began to carry more weight than the others: defense-centered economy, the idea that everything had to revolve around ensuring military ambitions. At that point, the showcase period began to end. The previous years had served two things simultaneously: inwardly, to calm and convince; outwardly, to take advantage of the international slowness inherited from the Versailles period. Because when Hitler arrived, the machinery did not start from zero. There was already an infrastructure for indirect rearmament, accumulated experience, and a camouflage method that the new power could accelerate, and Hitler understood something essential. A state can promise a future, but a dictatorship needs to demonstrate strength. Strength, in his logic, was constant preparation. That is why, when internal control was already greater and politics could be imposed without so many mediations, the economic direction changed abruptly. From 1936 onward, the party had already extended its tentacles, power was greater, and Hitler could do what a few years earlier he could not even imagine. That year was not a simple change of minister. It was the end of one phase and the beginning of another. Schacht, with his technocratic profile, had limits. He opposed uncontrolled armament development. His stage worked as a ramp: build support, give apparent stability, organize the ground. But the project that came next demanded something different. Not balance, but absolute priority. Cheating to survive, rearmament in the shadows, and calculated breach. When Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, disarmament was written with surgical precision. A reduced army, no heavy artillery, no military aviation under Allied supervision. On paper, the German threat was supposed to be extinguished forever. In practice, the General Staff made a different decision: not to argue the treaty loudly, but to hollow it out from within. It was not about breaking it head-on, but about learning to live within its words, using every ambiguity as a hiding place. The first trick was linguistic. Where artillery had once been mentioned, special technical equipment began to appear. Where drills were discussed, industrial exercises were signed off. Civilian vocabulary was not a detail, it was armor. In that same spirit, offices and agencies with bland names were established, supposedly dedicated to reconstruction, engineering, infrastructure, or research. Outwardly, Germany appeared to be recovering. Internally, these channels supported weapons experiments, stored components, and kept alive the technical muscle that a future war would require. Industry became the second refuge. Some plants were converted to civilian goods without moving engineers or shutting down key machines. The logic was simple: If inspectors were looking for cannons, plows were shown. If they asked about ammunition, metal pieces with no declared purpose were displayed. In the warehouses, however, there remained blueprints, molds, tools and procedures ready to be reactivated. Two categories of facilities were also created, visible ones designed for inspections and hidden ones disguised as repair workshops, spare parts depots or training centers. Production was fragmented so that no one could pinpoint a military focal point. One factory made loose parts, another assembled them, another stored them in remote warehouses. In the case of foreign visits, each plant could claim ignorance about the final use. Logistics also learned to lie. Under the pretext of keeping the railway system operational, special movements of technical cargo were reserved. Closed wagons traveled to discrete depots managed by civil units of the Ministry of Works. The documentation accompanied this theatre, alternative codes to account for material, different routes on internal maps, records written so that an audit would only find normalcy. A cannon could be a precision pressure instrument, a munitions depot, an inventory of compacted elements. The secret did not depend on thick walls, but on accounting capable of denying its own meaning. Personnel training followed the same choreography. Retired officers ran courses on mechanics, explosives, chemistry, or aerial navigation. Students did not wear uniforms, they were technicians. But the content included applied ballistics, coded communications, rapid deployments. Aviation, officially prohibited, was maintained through a side door, recreational, flying, and gliders. The body and instincts were trained without declaring an air force. Former military pilots taught maneuvers with the same care a surgeon uses instruments under dim light. Everything had to appear as something else. To this clandestinity were added social and political networks. Patriotic associations, veterans societies, and industrial consortia operated as intermediaries, funding, moving parts, recruiting young cadres. It was not exactly a parallel army, but a camouflaged extension of the previous one, a continuity system without a flag. And when external control tightened, Germany responded with an even finer method, moving technology out of the country. Links with companies in Sweden, Switzerland, or the Netherlands allowed plans, patents, and prototypes to be sent out of inspection reach. Thus, when the time came, there would be no need to invent from scratch. Innovation would be archived and protected. In that scenario, a second path to rearmament appeared, less industrial and more diplomatic. Gustav Stresemann. His method was not about breaking doors, but loosening hinges. He projected cooperation, accepted limits publicly, and simultaneously worked to deactivate the monitoring apparatus step by step. Locarno in 1925 was key. Germany recognized Western borders and, in doing so, gained political breathing space. In 1926, joining the League of Nations offered a platform. From within, Berlin could push for fairness, request adjustments, erode restrictions as if they were negotiable clauses rather than bars. The Control Commission began to reduce its presence. Controls did not collapse with an explosion. They wore down like metal under friction. While diplomacy opened space, military planning became more sophisticated. Between 1930 and 1933, the High Command intensified its secret rearmament in a context of Western passivity. Evasion worked on two levels. On one hand, administrative subterfuges to evade inspections. On the other, social camouflage, sports clubs, shooting associations, gymnastics, physical training. Combat was practiced under a civilian aesthetic. The line between civilian and military was deliberately blurred. These spaces shaped youth, human reserves ready to integrate when the state demanded. Money also learned to hide. With constant tension between military needs and fiscal limits, parallel budgets emerged, disguised items under civilian concepts, opaque accounting mechanisms. Rearmament had to grow without provoking reactions, and accounting became part of the arsenal. Abroad, the United Kingdom and France detected signals but reacted tepidly. Reports minimized, internal priorities weighed more than a vague threat. Disbelief, fatigue, and fear of new tensions left room. Berlin understood it as a signal it could advance. In 1933, with Hitler in power, the concealment system ceased to be just a tactic and became state doctrine. Clandestinity had already built the foundation: infrastructure, engineers, routes, codes, trained personnel. Now, a single order was enough to emerge from the shadows. The regime maintained what had been accumulated and expanded it. Previously, camouflaged factories could operate more freely. Companies linked to armament resumed state contracts. Officers who had lived in the ambiguous world of evasion became instructors of the new army. At the same time, propaganda established a narrative of right to defend oneself, and diplomats denied violations with carefully drafted documents. The growth of the army ceased to be disguised. Academies reopened, courses accelerated, and the administrative structure centralized to coordinate training, logistics, production, and doctrine in a general plan. Aviation received priority. Models presented as civilian were redesigned for military use, runways were expanded, restricted access test centers were created. Heavy artillery returned as a controlled project, recovered designs, new prototypes, reduced deadlines. Everything had to fit into a larger mechanism. In 1935 came the decisive step, the reinstatement of compulsory military service and the proclamation of a new armed force, the Wehrmacht. It was no longer an adjustment or an exception. It was an irreversible fact presented as a national symbol. Soon after, the Luftwaffe was officially established, which had for years operated under civilian cover. In parallel, the Navy reactivated shipyards and designed units exceeding tonnage limits, tested in protected facilities, incorporating destroyers and submarines with greater autonomy. The breach with Versailles was, in reality, not a leap. It was a staircase built over years, step by step, measuring the reaction of London and Paris. When those reactions did not go beyond statements, Berlin understood that the ground was clear. By 1936, the change was already irreversible. What had once been a latent machinery became an official structure at full capacity, with budgets, uniforms, ceremonies, and coordinated production, marking the rhythm of a country that no longer pretended to be disarmed. The four-year plan, turning the economy into a weapon. In 1936, the regime stopped acting as a government that administered a country and began behaving like a headquarters that managed resources. It was not a gradual change. It was a shift in priorities. Economic vocabulary began to revolve around a single idea, the defense-centered economy, and with this concept it was justified that everything be subordinated to war preparation. On the surface, Germany still seemed like a nation recovering. Inside, the state began to operate as a device of permanent mobilization. The transition had a face, Hermann Göring. Where Schacht had worked with a technocratic showcase logic, Göring entered with a single objective: to prepare the country for conflict, even if it meant completely distorting the normal functioning of the economy. His tool was the four-year plan, a roadmap designed to arm Germany to the teeth, reorganizing production and allocating resources as if already at war, even before firing a single shot. This plan was based on an explicit choice. If the regime had to choose between welfare and military capacity, the answer was already made. Weapons, weapons, and more weapons. Defense became priority number one, and this priority was not only expressed in speeches, but in tangible decisions that affected everyday life. One of the most revealing measures was the deliberate collapse of automobile production. It fell by more than 85% in just 3 years. It was not an industrial accident. It was a planned reduction to free materials, assembly lines, and labor that could be redirected to armaments. But the shift could not be sustained by cuts alone. To produce more weapons, the state needed to capture internal resources without the population being able to resist. And here a key mechanism appeared, limiting consumption so that money remained immobilized. The regime even designed a ration card system, not only to manage food or basic goods, but to prevent citizens from spending. The idea was brutally simple. If people could not buy, their savings would accumulate. If their savings accumulated, the banking system would be full of liquidity. And if the banks were full of liquidity, the state could force them to finance rearmament. The numbers showed this effect in stark terms. Bank deposits grew enormously. They went from 2,000 million marks in 1938 to 12,400 million in just 3 years. In other words, German accounts were overflowing, not because people were living better, but because the government limited spending. That idle money was transformed into fiscal and financial fuel. The regime pressured banks to lend to the state, and the state used that credit to continue expanding military factories, contracts, and deliveries in a cycle where private savings ended up converted into cannons, ammunition, and armor. At the same time, Fiscal pressure rose like a second clamp. It was not enough to immobilize consumption. Income had to be extracted directly. There were tax increases and a growing weight of the state on personal income. Even adjusting for inflation, by 1943, Germans were giving 75% more of their income to the state than in 1938. And although that figure belongs to the later period, the important thing is the trend. Since the 1936 shift, the state was moving toward a model in which the citizen ceased to be a consumer and became a financial resource. Rearmament, moreover, escalated to levels that reconfigured the entire national budget. Military spending went from being a relatively minor fraction to consuming the center of the system. Records from the time show a jump from 3% of GDP dedicated to the military sector to figures exceeding 50%, and even more if indirect revenues are considered. This was not a defense program within an economy. It was an entire economy devoted to war, where civilian normality was reduced to the bare minimum necessary to sustain production and social control. However, as money flowed, the regime faced a limit harder than any budget: nature. No matter the taxes, forced loans, or bank deposits, there were resources that could not be manufactured by decree. Iron and coal were the bottleneck. Without coal, furnaces could not stay lit. Without iron, there was no steel. Without steel, there was no artillery, armor, ships, or heavy machinery. And the problem was twofold. Germany not only faced difficulties in the quality and availability of iron, but the regime also distrusted the obedience of the major industrial magnates. In a market economy, a businessman decides based on profitability. In a war economy, the regime demanded obedience even if the project was unsustainable. Göring's response was to create a structure capable of absorbing that private resistance while concentrating the material heart of rearmament, the Reichswerke. It was not a simple consortium. It was a mega-conglomerate of iron, steel, and coal formed by public and private companies designed to expand production, impose investments, and control the flow of strategic raw materials. For some businessmen, it was a promise of guaranteed business. The state would invest, purchase, and sustain. For others, it was a threat. It meant unfair competition, loss of control, and the obligation to invest in projects that could fail, but that the regime imposed anyway. The essential point is that the Reichswerke represented a new way of governing the economy. If the private sector did not align, the state became the entrepreneur. If the industry did not produce what the plan demanded, the plan was imposed on the industry. Thus, the regime not only planned but also owned, managed, and directed. The boundary between state and industry blurred even further. Contracts, deliveries, and objectives began to resemble campaign orders, and every ton of steel was counted as if it were ammunition before an assault. This model had an immediate advantage. It accelerated concentration and allowed resources to be redirected quickly. But it also consolidated a dangerous logic. The economy ceased to respond to market signals and began responding to political goals. When this happens, incentives change. Efficiency matters less than obedience. Results matter less than the report. The written number weighs more than reality. In that culture, fertile ground was created for self-deception and the production of figures that pleased leadership. Even so, in the short term, the regime managed to impose a military priority shock. The 4-year plan was not only a rearmament program, it was the institutionalization of an idea, the economy as an extension of war. And in this scheme, autarky was not an economic ideal. It was a strategic necessity, reducing exports, concentrating inputs, subsidizing key sectors, allocating steel, coal, and labor as if already fighting. That is why the Reichswerke was not presented as just another company, but as a symbol. The regime's will to control the subsoil, iron, steel, energy, and turn them into a single entity, an industrial arm of the state. Göring took the final step with a gesture that summarized the entire philosophy of those years. He nationalized the land of Germany and turned the country into a gigantic iron mine. The failure of the perfect plan. The 4-year plan was sold as a straightforward recipe. Within a short period, Germany was supposed to be ready to sustain a modern war without depending on anyone. That was the promise. Armaments, fuel, steel, airplanes, fortifications, all moving forward as if the country could manufacture an inevitable superiority for itself. But when one looked beneath the propaganda, The central problem emerged. An economy can be pushed, but it cannot reinvent out of nothing the raw materials it lacks, nor magically multiply industrial coordination when the state replaces it with orders, fear, and doctored figures. Preparation began to show a chronic contradiction. The regime wanted to do everything at once. It wanted tanks and, at the same time, wanted vehicles for the people. It wanted construction projects, fortifications, expansion of the Luftwaffe, reorganization of the army. And on top of that, it wanted the population not to feel the blow too harshly. In a country with limited resources, that meant competing for the same inputs: steel, coal, rubber, fuel, skilled labor. What was allocated to one sector was missing in another, and this struggle was not resolved with economic efficiency but with the will of the leader. Here a typical feature of dictatorships appeared. The decision-making chain became so vertical that any real adjustment ended up blocked. From 1936, the allocation of the most important material, steel, was subjected to increasingly personalized control. It was not a technical committee balancing priorities. It was a system where the final yes depended on Hitler's explicit approval. This generated an immediate effect. No one wanted to contradict him. No one wanted to deliver bad news. No one wanted to sign cuts that could be interpreted as weakness. The result was not strict planning, but paralyzed planning, sustained by optimistic reports. Production then began to stagnate in the least visible but most decisive place: the bottlenecks. Germany could extract iron, accumulate it, transport it, but transforming that iron into steel required coal, and coal was a closed bottleneck. The state controlled inputs, blocked free purchases, and set priorities, but in doing so it destroyed the coordination mechanism that the market knew how to execute: when to buy, to whom to sell, how much to produce, how to distribute quickly when an industry stalled. With the market gone, factories lost a common language. Thus emerged scenes that, in a regime that claimed to be efficient, bordered on the absurd. Companies with mountains of iron but no capacity to turn it into steel for lack of coal, and no possibility of obtaining it on their own because coal was in the hands of the state. This type of administrative collapse had a constant feature. It did not appear in speeches. It was visible in workshops, in stopped production lines, in wasted hours and equipment. A militarized economy does not break just from lack of money. It breaks when materials are in the country, but not in the right place, at the right time, with the right energy. And what the plan imposed was a rigidity that multiplied these errors. At the same time, the regime accumulated another type of pressure, the promise of impossible quantities. The 4-year plan set concrete targets of steel allocated to the army, but in practice, the volume that arrived was below what had been planned. The difference between the expected and the real was not a small statistical deviation. It was a systematic, repeated gap that revealed the plan did not dominate the economy as it claimed. It was rather the opposite. The real economy resisted, and the plan responded with cosmetic fixes. This gap between goal and reality became more evident when deadlines were considered. The weapons production scheduled for 1939 was not reached until 1942. And the fortifications, which were supposed to be ready as part of the Reich's defensive architecture, were so delayed that their completion was projected for after the end of the war. In other words, when the regime entered the conflict, it did so with incomplete preparation, relying more on operational speed and strategic shock than on sustained productive superiority. This point is key to understanding the subsequent myth. Germany did not dominate Europe in its initial moves because it had built a perfect war economy, but because it combined accelerated rearmament with surprise, aggressiveness, and military decisions that exploited the political weaknesses of its neighbors. The problem is that this logic of rapid victories became a narcotic. It reinforced the idea that the system worked, and this illusion allowed the regime to keep demanding more without correcting structural failures. In that tension, internal conflict became inevitable. Hjalmar Schacht, the technocrat who had supported the regime's economic launch, opposed it when the project took the form of an unrestrained war economy. He considered the leadership incompetent, and the political conflict ended in the usual way in a dictatorship: the one who objects falls. Schacht was dismissed, lost his position at the Reichsbank, and years later even ended up imprisoned in Dachau. This trajectory revealed an uncomfortable truth. The system did not tolerate anyone saying, "This doesn't add up." And the closer total war approached, the more failures were attempted to be compensated with brute force. If labor was lacking, it was taken. If hands were missing, they were imported by force. If the population had to sustain the effort without protesting, control was tightened and the burden pushed onto those who could not resist. Labor exploitation became a state mechanism, and not only under public control, private companies participated and benefited. Prisoners and deportees were sent to factories, mines, construction. The government rented human beings as if they were machinery, and companies paid for that use. At the height of the war, the number of people subjected to forced labor reached millions, representing a huge portion of the German workforce. The war economy then was sustained not only with steel and coal, but with organized slavery. Even so, not even that industrial crime solved the fundamental problem. The plan still failed to meet its essential targets. The four-year plan failed on its own terms. It did not achieve the promised production goals, and stagnation became visible from the late 30s. Despite increased spending, military production did not grow as the regime proclaimed. The machinery was over-demanded, coordination was clumsy, inputs were scarce, and lies became the lubricant of the chain of command. And when the system becomes accustomed to lying upward, reality ends up striking from below. Numbers could be adorned, reports could sound grandiose, but facts were exposed in concrete details. At the start of the invasion of Poland in 1939, the number of modern tanks was surprisingly low. Fighter plane production was far from promised, and the schedule the regime had written for its superpower was slipping forward like a debt no one wanted to acknowledge. The Reich's economy at that point was already a machine strained to its limit, disciplined in appearance but clumsy inside, powerful in propaganda but vulnerable in resources, capable of imposing massive suffering but incapable of fulfilling its own plans without enormous delays. In this scenario, the regime sought a typical solution, not to correct the system, but to find someone who could make it work better without questioning its logic. And it was there, with the war already underway and productive chaos accumulated, that the man who would later be sold as the father of the armaments miracle, Albert Speer, began to gain prominence. The miracle of Speer and the economy that was no longer enough. When the war became prolonged, what had begun as a planned mobilization project ended up turning into a desperate race to hold the front. The image that the regime had sold for years collided with physical reality. Materials were lacking, fuel was lacking, coordination was lacking, and above all, time was lacking. And yet the Nazi state insisted on the same slogan: more weapons, more planes, more armored vehicles at any cost. That cost was no longer a metaphor. To sustain the machine, the regime had been closing internal consumption valves, imposing limits, and designing a country where the ordinary citizen did not spend because, in practice, they were not allowed to. Bank accounts grew not out of prosperity, but because of rationing, and the state found there a useful financial lever to continue pushing military production. At the same time, fiscal pressure hardened, and the entire economy was reorganized as if there were a single client: the war. What was not necessary was sacrificed without remorse. Civilian production lines were reduced, incompatible projects were cancelled, steel quotas were diverted from one sector to another, and the planning apparatus became more rigid and more dependent on personal decisions. Within that rigidity hid a contradiction. The regime demanded impossible results and punished bad news. In such a dictatorship, the numbers had to add up. No one wanted to be the official who explained to the leader that his goal was unfeasible. And when reality resisted, the plan was not corrected. The report was doctored, promises were made that could not be fulfilled, and the problem was kicked down the road. On paper, everything seemed to be progressing. In logistics, bottlenecks accumulated. Iron might exist, but coal to convert it was missing. The factory could have orders, but not supplies. The workshop could have labor, but not standard parts. The market had been suffocated, and what remained was an administrative labyrinth where each office defended its quota and its survival. This context explains why, when the regime needed a face for efficiency, it found Albert Speer. Popular history presents him as the great organizer, the technocrat who saved German production with rationality, discipline, and method. Propaganda molded him as the man who would do more with less. just as the country began to notice that the war was no longer a succession of quick victories, but a constant erosion. Speer came in with a clear prescription: concentrate decisions, cut dispersion, impose a single command where there had previously been bureaucracies and rivalries. Instead of allowing hundreds of plants to produce the same thing with different standards, he bet on closing the least productive, concentrating the efficient and simplifying models. It was neither a romantic nor brilliant idea. It was the kind of rationalization that emerges when the system cannot sustain its own complexity. Fewer variants, fewer types, fewer different parts, more repetition, more chain, more mass production. And in that simplification, the regime began to show numbers that, at least on the surface, rose sharply. More planes per month, fewer hours per unit, more output of military material. But the problem was not only how much came out of the factory, but how it was made to come out. Production grew, yes, but not because of a miracle that had overcome material limitations. It grew because the regime continued diverting resources from other areas that did not appear in the triumphant report, because the plundering of occupied territories provided coal, steel, and industrial capacity, because quotas were reorganized from above, and because the human cost multiplied. It was not pure efficiency. It was absolute priority applied with brutality. Labor is the clearest example. The state not only reorganized German workers toward military sectors, it also exploited the darkest component of the system: industrial slavery. Jews, prisoners of war, and deportees were integrated as a labor force without rights, without real wages, without escape. And not only in state facilities, private companies participated in the mechanism, receiving prisoners rented by the government as if they were production inputs. At the peak in 1944, the number of forced workers exceeded several million and represented a huge fraction of the workforce within Germany. That reality was not a marginal excess, it was part of the architecture of the war effort. Propaganda, however, preferred another story. Speer served to tell a comforting narrative. If we tighten a little more, if we organize better, if we work with discipline, we will win. That narrative fit the psychological moment of the regime. They needed to convince the population that the sacrifice still made sense. They also needed to explain why, despite the supposed German industrial greatness, it was increasingly difficult to sustain the war. This is why the so-called armament miracle was deceptive. The data existed, but they were built on convenient comparisons and a selective cut of what was accounted for. Ammunition or certain models' production increased, but at the expense of sinking other sectors. Volume rose, but not necessarily the real productivity of the whole. Chains were accelerated, but quality was lost. The pressure to produce more units led to simplifying designs, standardizing out of necessity, and postponing innovation because innovating requires time, testing, line changes, and risky investment. The regime preferred to repeat and push, even if that degraded the final result. The degradation was visible in the material sent to combat. What had once been cutting edge could become under rushed production with no margin for improvement, fragile equipment, dangerous for its own crew, or incapable of keeping pace with modern warfare. Added to this was another blow that no reorganization could manage from a desk: Allied bombings. At the moment when the German apparatus seemed to find a way to concentrate and produce in series, the sky forced it to disperse again. Industry fragmented to survive, plants were relocated, makeshift workshops multiplied, efficiency in logistics was lost, and new frictions appeared. The system tried to become more modern, but the war pushed it toward ever more defensive, dispersed, and precarious production. And so the image of Germany as an industrial superpower was sustained by a mixture of myth, plunder, convenient accounting, and massive violence. The machine produced, but not because it had found the perfect formula. It produced because the regime squeezed internal resources, stole external ones, forced slave labor, and cut quality, while bombings forced the dissolution of the same industrial concentration that Speer had tried to impose. Autarky with a trick. When the superpower needed to conquer to produce on paper, the 4-year plan promised a self-sufficient Germany, shielded against blockades and capable of sustaining a long war without collapsing due to lack of materials. In practice, that promise collided with a limit that neither propaganda nor fear could dissolve: geology. The regime could squeeze the population, pressure banks, raise taxes, order industries around, but it could not extract from the ground what wasn't there in sufficient quantity, nor change the quality of resources with a speech. The problem was concrete and had a name: iron and coal. Without steel, there was no modern war, and without coal, there was no steel. That is why the economic shift of 1936 was not just a reorganization of factories, but a race to dominate the material heart of power. And when that heart did not respond as Goering promised, the regime invented a solution that seemed industrial but was actually political: the Reichswerke. The Reichswerke was presented as a technical response, a mega conglomerate of iron, steel and coal made up of public and private companies, with the state deeply involved to guarantee investment, production and obedience. It was a way of saying, if the private sector doesn't want to or can't, the state will take command. Some magnates were delighted. It meant secure money, guaranteed contracts, large-scale public investment. Others saw it as a direct threat because the model implied unfair competition, loss of control, and, above all, the obligation to invest in projects that could be unsustainable but that the regime imposed anyway. Within this mechanism was a key idea. The Nazi economy wanted to function as a war machine, but the businessmen remained businessmen. The state had to tame that logic, and the Reichswerke functioned as both a carrot and a whip. With it, Goering was not only reorganizing industry, he was reorganizing power. A consortium of that size was a political instrument. Those who joined were under control. Those who resisted were pushed, bought, absorbed, or marginalized. The regime took it to the extreme with a symbolic and brutal gesture. Goering nationalized the land and transformed the country into a gigantic iron mine. The phrase was not just rhetoric, it described the essence of the project. Autarky required transforming every inch of Germany into war material, as if the entire territory existed to feed the furnaces. The problem was that even exploiting domestic iron as far as possible was not enough. The raw material remained insufficient for the plan's delirious goals. And here comes the second pillar of the model, autarky, but with a trick. The official idea was clear: do not depend on imports, do not be tied to foreign markets, do not be vulnerable to a naval blockade like the one that had strangled Germany in World War I. Goering did not want to hear about bringing metal from abroad, but the regime quickly discovered the contradiction. If Germany did not have what it needed, self-sufficiency was a story, so the plan changed without admitting it. If the resources were not going to Germany, Germany would go to the resources. This trick was the bridge between the economy and conquest. Territorial expansion ceased to be just an ideological obsession and became, in addition, a supply operation. In 1938, the Third Reich carried out the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. In speeches, it was national reunification. In war accounting, it was adding resources, industry, reserves, and a strategic corridor. Soon after came Czechoslovakia and then Poland. And although the regime spoke of history, destiny, and greatness, the economic machine understood something else: coal, steel, factories, infrastructure. From 1938 onward, all the extra steel produced by Germany came precisely from the occupied countries. It was not a marginal detail, it was the engine of the increase. The supposed independence was sustained by the conquered dependency, and the hardest blow was in coal. The occupied territories supplied 80% of the coal needed for German industry. That fact explains why the Nazi economy, even when it seemed like a superpower, lived on the edge of its own fragility. It was not a self-sufficient fortress, it was a system that needed to expand in order not to run out of fuel. At that point, the concept of superpower becomes misleading. Germany could produce more armaments, yes, but that more was tied to one condition: maintaining expansion and plunder. The economy became addicted to conquest. Each new territory was not only propaganda, it was an injection of energy, steel, and industrial capacity. That is why a strategic defeat would not only be a military defeat, it would be a logistical collapse. If expansion was halted or the flow of resources cut off, the industrial heart would be left without oxygen, and it was not just steel and coal. Expansion incorporated brands, plants, technology, and labor from subjugated countries. A clear example of this was Skoda. That Czech industry, with experience and capacity, was incorporated into the Reich's machinery. It was not a trophy. It was a factory, a production line ready to feed the war effort. This is how the trick worked. Autarky no longer meant producing everything at home, but turning the home into an increasingly larger territory, where conquered factories became German by decree. This reshapes the reading of the years leading up to the war. Rearmament was not just an internal act, but a project that needed external space to sustain itself. Germany was preparing for a total war, but its economy was not designed to withstand a closed world. It was designed to open the world by force. Each annexation solved an immediate problem and at the same time created a bigger problem, the need to keep annexing, because the system had already bet everything on that source of resources. And there, without needing an announcement, the Nazi economy ceased to be a defense economy and became an expansion economy. War was not the accident that could occur. It was the mechanism that completed the plan. That is why the step from 1938 to 1939 was not an unexpected leap, but the logical consequence of an autarky that depended on occupying territories to fire its furnaces, sustain steel, maintain coal, and absorb industries like Skoda into the Reich's machinery. The apparent superpower, producing, looting, and relying on what was conquered. From the outside, the Third Reich began to appear as a superpower because it seemed to fulfill an irresistible formula: internal order, industrial discipline, and a military capacity growing at a speed that was frightening. But that image was built on a carefully sustained illusion. No matter how much the regime had managed to subdue the banks, tighten taxes, ration consumption, and redirect entire factories toward armaments, it still faced the same limit that no decree could repeal. Natural resources cannot be voted on, printed, or invented. This is why the economic shift cannot be understood by looking only at factories within Germany, but must be viewed on the map. The supposed self-sufficiency was, in reality, a two-faced trick. The first was internal: restrict consumption to free up materials, freeze private spending, and convert forced savings into credit for the state. Citizens saw ration cards and prohibitions. The regime saw bank deposits growing like a water reservoir ready to be released toward the military industry. In just 3 years, these deposits rose from 2 billion marks to 12.4 billion, and this mass of immobilized money became a source that the state forced banks to lend to continue producing weapons. Abundance was not prosperity, it was economic confinement. The second phase was external. If Germany could not obtain resources through trade and did not want to depend on imports, the alternative was to appropriate them. That is why territorial expansion functioned as an industrial lever. The annexation of Austria, the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, the invasion of Poland, all of this had an ideological discourse, but it also had an immediate translation into coal, iron, factories, infrastructure, and production capacity forcibly incorporated. The model was brutal and efficient in its logic. What was lacking in the Reich was sought outside the Reich, and by capturing it, it was converted into property of the war effort. This is where the myth of autarky collapses. From 1938 onward, the extra steel that Nazi Germany managed to produce came precisely from the occupied countries. And even more revealing, the conquered territories supplied 80% of the coal necessary for the German industry. This dependency changes everything because it turns the superpower into a system addicted to its own expansion. The moment the Reich stopped advancing, or the moment the coal flow was interrupted, the industrial machinery was left without real energy, without the fuel that allows iron to become steel and steel to become war. This logic explains why so many early conquests had a value that went beyond the front. They were industrial injections. It was not only about territory, but also about brands, workshops, assembly lines, technicians, and suppliers. Companies and plants from subjugated countries were absorbed to produce within a militarized economy that could no longer afford to respect economic borders. Conquest became, at the same time, strategy and supply. The Reich began to appear as a superpower because its national capacity was not strictly national. It was the result of forcibly adding the defeated economies. But that addiction had a hidden cost. Instead of building a stable base, the system was sustained by extraordinary resources, looting, extreme control of civilian life, and an expansion that needed to keep feeding itself. And since modern war is not sustained only with steel and coal, but with labor, the regime added the other piece of its engineering: human exploitation as an industrial policy. When production demand increased and the war ceased to be a sequence of quick strikes, Hitler did not hesitate to turn people into inputs. By 1944, the number of prisoners subjected to forced labor exceeded 7.5 million, reaching nearly a fifth of the entire workforce within Germany. They were not workers, they were slaves. The allocation was almost accounting-like: French to agriculture, Soviets to industry, Jews to a concentration system where work was mixed with extermination. And the mechanism was not only state-run. Private companies received prisoners sent from camps like Auschwitz and used them in factories, construction, or mines. The government rented that labor, and the companies paid for it, while the prisoner received nothing. The apparent superpower did not rely only on metal, it relied on an administration of horror. Even with this level of extraction, the Nazi economy continued to show a central flaw. The 4-year plan failed on its own terms. Production targets were not met, and the overall growth of military production since 1936 remained stagnant despite increased spending. The gap between what was planned and what was real was constant. Of the 270,000 tons of steel the plan allocated to the army per month, only 195,000 were received. The schedule slipped like shifting ground. What was planned for 1939 was only achieved in 1942, and the completion of fortifications was projected for 1948, 3 years after the war ended. The Germany that seemed ready actually entered the conflict with disorganized and delayed preparation. This fragility was not explained solely by lack of resources. It was explained by the anatomy of the dictatorship. No one wanted to contradict the leader, and in that climate, the economy was governed as if it were a matter of will. From 1936 onward, no relevant change in steel quotas was approved without Hitler's explicit consent. If the plan was surreal, the plan was not corrected. Deviations were hidden, lies were told upwards, figures were doctored, the impossible was promised, and those who objected were punished. The economy became a theatre where reports had to sound good, even if furnaces had no coal or production lines ran out of parts. This same culture fed the later myth of Albert Speer. He was installed as the father of the armament miracle, the man who supposedly brought modern rationalization, centralizing decisions, closing less productive factories, concentrating in large companies, homogenizing machinery, reducing the number of models, and betting on economies of scale. The narrative was appealing because it offered hope, doing more with less, just as the population began to notice that the war was becoming endless. According to that version, Speer transformed German industry into a mass production machine in the style of Henry Ford. But the reality was less clean. Production did increase, yes, but that growth was sustained by doctored statistics and hidden sacrifices that did not appear in the reports. If ammunition increased, it was not because factories had suddenly discovered a production secret, but because more steel was allocated to them at the expense of other sectors, and largely thanks to the systematic theft of resources in occupied territories. The less never truly arrived. In some processes, waste was reduced, but at the same time, the number of workers dedicated to producing tanks increased by 60%. That is, it was pushed with more people, more inputs, and more extraction, not with miraculous efficiency born out of nothing. As the war dragged on, the portrait of Germany as a superpower began to show cracks that could no longer be covered up with parades alone. During the early years, the regime had managed to build a sense of accelerated transformation. Factories operating, soldiers marching, fighters flying overhead, a recovered nation. That staging was real in form but incomplete in substance. The problem was that the country had not become a perfect machine. It had become a tense machine, fueled by extreme measures, conquered resources, and an economic method that worked as long as there was something left to squeeze. The core of that method was brutally simple. If a choice had to be made between welfare and war, the choice was already made. The 4-year plan functioned as an order of priorities written in steel. To free up materials and industrial capacity, the regime drastically reduced civilian production. An example that illustrates this without the need for grand theories was the automotive industry. Car production dropped by more than 85% in just 3 years. It was not a modern industrial reform. It was the deliberate abandonment of a consumer economy to convert production lines, labor, and raw materials into weaponry. The next step was to discipline citizens as if they were an economic resource of the state. The tool was rationing. Ration cards not only distributed goods, they froze consumption. People could have money, but they could not spend it. This prohibition generated an accounting effect useful to the regime. Bank deposits swelled massively, rising from 2,000 million marks in 1938 to 12,400 million in just 3 years. The miracle was a lockdown, overflowing accounts because spending was blocked. The third component was taxation. In a normal economy, raising taxes too quickly can sink consumption, investment, and activity. In a war economy, that no longer matters because consumption is already restricted and investment is already directed. Therefore, in that war cocktail, the regime added sustained tax increases. Adjusted for inflation, in 1943, Germans were giving 75% more of their income to the state than in 1938. The war was not financed through a single channel, but with a clamp, rationing to immobilize spending and savings, taxes to extract directly, and banks forced to transform private deposits into state muscle. But even with that financial control, the real problem remained the same. Industrial war is sustained by resources, not money. Steel was the lifeblood of the system, and coal was the oxygen for steel. Without coal, iron piled up uselessly. And here an internal contradiction appeared. The state had reduced the market to a minimum, and without a market, factories lost an efficient way to coordinate. The practical result was an economy that called itself planned, but that jammed on its own. Plants with enormous amounts of iron that could not be converted into steel due to lack of coal, and that also could not buy coal because the government controlled it. Planning, which was supposed to ensure fluidity, ended up generating paralysis at critical points. The regime's response to this fragility was to expand industrial control. The Reichswerke was the symbol of this leap, a mega-conglomerate of iron, steel, and coal that mixed public and private companies, designed to impose investments, direct production, and subordinate the private sector to military logic. Goering took this logic to the extreme with a gesture of power. He nationalized German land and turned the country into a giant iron mine. It was not a poetic figure, it was the image of a state that wanted to extract from the territory everything it could to keep furnaces burning and military contracts active. However, the paradox did not disappear. The regime could tighten control internally, but externally it still needed resources, and that need made the Nazi economy addicted to expansion. Autarky was not real self-sufficiency, it was dependence on what had been conquered. Even under this extreme effort, the 4-year plan did not meet its production goals. Of the 270,000 tons of steel the plan allocated to the army each month, only 195,000 were received. What was scheduled for 1939 was not completed until 1942, and the completion of fortifications was projected for 1948. Propaganda said, "ready," but real accounting said, "late." That gap between goals and reality was not a technical accident. It was a consequence of the political system. In a dictatorship, information is distorted because no one wants to contradict the leader. In this case, from 1936 onward, no relevant change in steel quotas was approved without Hitler's explicit consent. If the targets were absurd, few dared to question them. When someone did, the system expelled them. Schacht, the technocrat who had led the regime's economic launch, firmly opposed the shift toward a war economy directed by Goering. He was eventually dismissed, lost his post at the Reichsbank, and in 1944 was sent to Dachau. The message was unequivocal. The economy was not a technical debate, it was obedience. And when obedience is not enough to produce resources, the regime resorts to the last input it can always take: human beings. At the peak of the war, in 1944, the number of forced labor prisoners exceeded 7.5 million, nearly a fifth of the entire labor force in Germany. The distribution was functional: French prisoners to agriculture, Soviet prisoners to industry, Jews to a concentration labor system. The mechanism was also profitable for the state and for private companies. Prisoners from camps like Auschwitz were sent to factories, construction, and mines. The government rented them as slaves, and private companies paid a price from which the prisoner received nothing. The war effort was sustained not only with steel and coal, but with the administration of slavery. Even so, even with rationing, taxes, forced banking, state control of industries, annexations, and slave labor, The system continued to hit its limit. The armaments miracle later marketed was, to a large extent, propaganda. Production soared in some areas, but at the cost of simplifying and sacrificing innovation, which degraded quality. Planes that had initially been cutting-edge ended up as dangerous machines, and even the most advanced models retained flaws derived from the logic of producing a lot and fast. The motto, "do more with less," served to keep the population mobilized when the economy could no longer keep up and people were starting to notice. From 1943 onward, Allied bombings forced the Nazi industry to disperse again. What Speer had tried to concentrate to gain speed and scale had to be fragmented to survive. Improvised workshops, plants moved to the periphery, production hidden underground, assembly lines split into dozens of parts so that a single bomb would not destroy everything. And each of these solutions brought its own cost: more transport, more failures, more delays, more loss of real control. The economy that boasted of being a perfect machine began to act like a wounded body, running blood through too many open wounds at the same time. This dispersal did not only affect industry. It hit logistics, maintenance, training, and replacement. A tank was not just a tank, it was steel, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, trucks to move it, workers to repair it, and a chain of suppliers that had to function like clockwork. In the early years, Germany had bet on quick strikes and short campaigns because its economic system performed better under the pace of offense than under the weight of prolonged war. But when the front extended, when fuel became gold, and when every ton of coal had to compete against winter, the system began to reveal what it was: a project that seemed invincible while advancing, but weakened in the very act of sustaining itself. Here the circle closed. The superpower was not built as a stable modernization, but as a forced conversion: rationing to immobilize consumption, private savings converted into mandatory credit, rising taxes, controls over steel, and an industry subjected to political targets rather than technical realities. When that was not enough, the regime extended the frontier of plunder. It annexed territories to obtain coal and steel, absorbed foreign factories to produce as if they were its own, and turned millions of people into slave labor to fill gaps that the system could not otherwise cover. And in the end, that was the project's ultimate trap. Germany did not prepare to be a stable power, but to be a power at permanent war. When that war stopped obeying its plans, the superpower revealed its truth. It was not a solid economic peak, but an extreme construction, built by force of control, dependence, and destruction.